The room is already quiet, but Funky still stops. Not for long, just long enough for everyone watching to feel it. That pause isn't accidental. It's the kind of hesitation that tells you this moment wasn't scripted, wasn't rehearsed, and definitely wasn't planned. The cameras are rolling, the audience is tuned in, and something heavy settles into the air before a single word is spoken. When Funky finally opens his mouth, his voice doesn't rise. It sharpens. Not loud, not theatrical, just tight enough to sound like restraint finally cracking. He starts by saying something that immediately shifts the energy in the room. He never wanted what transpired with Tamar to transpire. And he's not proud of it. That sentence alone is enough to send comment sections into motion. But what makes it hit harder is how he says it. There's no smirk, no joke, no performative outrage. This doesn't feel like gossip being spilled for clicks. It feels personal. Funky turns his attention directly toward Tamar, not with shade, not with humor, but with a frustration that sounds like it's been sitting unresolved for a long time. He makes one thing clear right away. He never asked to be part of whatever this situation has become. And more importantly, he cannot tolerate how the story was framed once it hit the internet. Then comes the line that detonates everything. Funky calls Tamar a bold-faced liar. No qualifiers, no softening, no walking it back. Within minutes, clips are ripped, reposted, slowed down, looped, and blasted across social media. Comment sections ignite instantly. People rewind, rewatch, debate tone, debate intent, debate history, debate loyalty. And everyone starts asking the same question. If Funky is saying Tamar's version isn't true, then what actually happened that night? But Funky doesn't just deny her story. He dismantles it, piece by piece. The birthday narrative, the confusion narrative, the suggestion that Tamar didn't know what happened to her. According to Funky, none of it aligns with reality. He accuses Tamar of doing something very specific, something the internet knows all too well. He says she does just enough to spark outrage, and then pulls her hands back once the fire spreads. Enough ambiguity to invite speculation. Enough vagueness to avoid direct accountability. And when someone finally calls it out, she shifts the framing, changes locations, reorders timelines, softens language, until suddenly, the night looks nothing like how it actually unfolded. Funky quotes the part that bothers him most, the moment Tamar publicly suggested she didn't know what happened to her, that she wasn't aware, that the night was a blur. He doesn't mock her emotions. He challenges the logic. Because according to him, this wasn't a chaotic accident of a night. It was structured. It was deliberate. Decisions were made. Calls were placed. Locations were chosen and changed multiple times. And that's where his frustration sharpens. Because details matter once stories stop being private and start becoming public storms. He walks through the beginning of the night slowly, methodically, almost like someone correcting a police report. They were looking for food. Places were closed. Roof Chris became the meeting point. Nothing about his tone suggests danger. Nothing suggests fear. Nothing suggests confusion. Which is why, according to Funky, the later narrative feels so jarring. Because online, Tamar would later say she woke up in a pool of blood, that she almost died, that an ambulance should have been called. But Funky points out the contradiction. If the situation was truly life-threatening, why was an emergency response the first move? Why did the story reach the internet before it reached authorities? He doesn't say nothing happened. He says the way it was told created confusion powerful enough to swallow everyone around it. And once that confusion hit social media, it didn't stay contained to Tamar. It spread. Vast. It reached everyone who had been seen with her that night, including him. As Funky continues, his tone doesn't escalate, it steadies. That's what unsettles people most. He doesn't sound emotional, he sounds certain. He brings up the group dynamic, a phrase he repeats just enough times for viewers to catch the pattern. Enough times to suggest this wasn't a one-off interaction. Restaurants, cars, public settings. Then Mendeecees enters the picture. Not invited, according to Funky. Not expected. Just suddenly present. He doesn't accuse. He doesn't speculate motives. He simply describes proximity. How Tamar was sitting on Mendy's lap. How they were kissing in the back of the Uber. How the intimacy was public, not hidden. And that moment changes everything. Because according to Funky, that's when the night stopped being his plan. That's when the energy shifted. And that's when he decided to leave. He explains something that later becomes a major point of controversy. When they arrived back at Tamar's house, he did not go upstairs. Not because he didn't care. Not because he was dismissive. But because he believed Tamar and Mendeecees wanted privacy. So he got in his car. And he went home. That decision, simple at the time, later becomes the fulcrum of the entire controversy. Because Funky makes one thing absolutely clear. He was not upstairs. According to him, the only people who went upstairs with Tamar that night were Mendeecees and his friend. He repeats this again and again. Not defensively. Correctively. And once that field of uncertainty narrows, the internet does what it always does. It speculates. Arrest talk. Health rumors. Network fallout whispers. Nothing confirmed. Nothing proven. But once speculation gains focus, it doesn't need facts to grow. And then something else happens. Silence. Tamar says nothing. Mendy says nothing. And that silence becomes louder than any statement ever could. Fans begin noticing Mendeecees appearing less connected to love and hip-hop. No announcement, no explanation, just absence. And now the question is what Funky said. It's whether his interview quietly triggered consequences that were already waiting behind the scenes. Because if this all started here, then what followed might not have been an internet reaction at all. It might have been something already in motion. What happens next doesn't explode. It settles. And that's what makes it dangerous. After Funky's words begin circulating, the internet doesn't rush toward clarity. It does the opposite. It slows down, replays, isolates phrases, dissects tone, and starts building meaning in the gaps between what was said and what wasn't. The shift isn't loud. It's subtle. It's tonal. Funky continues speaking, but what stands out isn't volume or anger. It's certainty. He doesn't sound like someone speculating. He doesn't sound like someone chasing relevance. He sounds like someone trying to stop a record from being permanently written the wrong way. He zeroes in on one thing over and over again. The narrative. According to Funky, the problem was never Tamar speaking publicly. It was how she spoke. The framing. The implication without specificity. The way confusion was presented as fact-adjacent, just close enough to truth that the internet could finish the story on its own. And the internet always finishes the story. He repeats the part that bothers him most, the suggestion that Tamar didn't know what happened to her, that she wasn't aware, that the night was wrapped in mystery, innocence, and shock. Funky doesn't dismiss her emotions. He challenges the logic behind the presentation. Because in his telling, this wasn't a chaotic spiral where things just happened. This was a night filled with conscious decisions, calls made, locations chosen, plans adjusted repeatedly. And once those details exist, the idea of complete confusion becomes harder to accept. He walks through the night again, not emotionally, but chronologically. They were trying to eat. Places were closed. Roof Chris became the meeting spot. Ordinary, almost boring. And that's exactly why the later story unsettles him. Because when Tamar went online, she didn't describe an ordinary night. She described trauma, blood, near death, emergency-level harm. But Funky points out something that viewers immediately latch onto. There was no ambulance. No emergency call. No immediate investigation. Not at the time. That contradiction matters, not because it proves anything, but because it creates confusion powerful enough to swallow everyone nearby. Funky says once that confusion hit social media, it didn't stay contained to Tamar. It expanded outward, attaching itself to anyone who had been publicly associated with her that night, including him. He describes watching the reaction unfold in real time, messages flooding in, comments escalating, accusations forming faster than facts ever could. Clips pulled out of context, pauses interpreted as guilt, silence treated like implication. And because Funky had been seen with Tamar earlier that night, suspicion began to orbit him, even though, according to him, he had already removed himself from the situation entirely. This is where his frustration hardens into resentment. He says Tamar understands exactly how the internet works, how implication functions, how to stir curiosity without making direct claims, how to ignite interest while maintaining plausible distance from specifics. Funky suggests this isn't accidental behavior. It's familiar behavior. He says Tamar does just enough to provoke reaction, and then pulls back before clarity arrives. That statement lands hard online. Not because it proves intent, but because it reframes the chaos. Suddenly, viewers aren't just debating what happened. They're debating why it was framed the way it was. Was the ambiguity a byproduct of trauma? Or was it a strategy? Comment sections fracture instantly. One side argues Tamar was speaking from shock, pain, and emotional distress. That precision shouldn't be expected in moments of vulnerability. The other side argues that vagueness carries responsibility when it implicates others. That public storytelling has consequences whether intended or not. Funky doesn't claim motive. He claims pattern. And that distinction matters. Because what he's describing isn't a single incident, it's repeated behavior he says he's witnessed before. Moments where things are said loudly enough to spark reaction, then quietly withdrawn before accountability arrives. In that framework, the internet isn't an accident. It's a tool. As this interpretation spreads, attention shifts again. Away from Funky. Away even from Tamar. Toward Mendeecees. Not because Funky accuses him of anything new, but because Funky's account places him closest to the unanswered questions. Funky acknowledges how this looks. He knows people will accuse him of being messy, vindictive, or attention-hungry. He anticipates the backlash and accepts it openly. He says people can paint him as messy, and he'll wear it. That moment changes how audiences interpret his anger. It no longer sounds reactive. It sounds resigned. Like someone who understands the cost of speaking and decides to speak anyway. Online, viewers begin reframing Funky not as an instigator, but as someone trying to avoid being crushed by a narrative he never agreed to be part of. At the same time, a parallel conversation starts forming. What happens to the people who don't speak? As Funky lays out his discomfort with the dynamic between Tamar and Mendeecees, commenters start replaying old clips, analyzing body language, revisiting public appearances. Not to uncover new facts, but to test coherence. The internet doesn't demand proof at this stage. It demands consistency. And the silence from Tamar and Mendeecees creates a vacuum where interpretation thrives. Funky addresses this silence indirectly. He explains that when the internet first turned on him, he didn't rush to defend himself. He stayed quiet, absorbed it, trusted that truth would surface on its own. But it didn't. Instead, the narrative hardened. He was labeled disloyal, opportunistic, attention-seeking. People questioned why he didn't go upstairs with Tamar, framing his absence as abandonment instead of intention. That accusation cuts deeper than the rest. Funky responds to it directly. He reiterates that he didn't go upstairs because he believed Tamar and Mendeecees wanted privacy. He frames his decision not as neglect, but as respect. This explanation becomes one of the most polarizing moments of the entire interview. Supporters argue he set a boundary. Critics argue real friends stay regardless of discomfort. But both sides agree on one thing. That decision matters, because it establishes who was present and who was. And once that boundary is drawn, scrutiny shifts almost entirely onto Mendeecees. Not as a verdict, as a question. Online discussions grow more careful, but heavier. Phrases like allegedly and according to fill comment sections. No one claims certainty. But repetition alone creates weight. Speculation builds about legal pressure, about professional distancing, about whether silence is strategic or enforced. Nothing is confirmed. But perception doesn't wait for confirmation. Funky seems acutely aware of how dangerous this phase is. He repeatedly clarifies that he doesn't know what happened upstairs. He refuses to fill in gaps. He avoids conclusions even when baited. That restraint, paradoxically, fuels more speculation than accusation ever could. Because now the audience feels trusted to decide for themselves. As this section closes, the tone grows heavier. The story stops advancing through new information. It starts looping. Reactions feeding reactions. Silence magnifying itself. The internet circling unanswered questions like gravity wells. And beneath it all, a realization begins to settle in. This story doesn't need resolution to cause damage. It only needs time. And time paired with uncertainty has a way of turning speculation into consequence. By the time the interview finishes making its rounds, something has already changed. Not the facts, not the evidence, not the official record. The energy. Because in stories like this, the internet doesn't need a verdict to choose a direction. It just needs a center of gravity, a person, a detail, a moment that feels like the hinge. And Funky, whether he intended to or not, draws the map. He doesn't accuse Mendeecees directly of doing anything upstairs. He doesn't claim he witnessed harm. He doesn't describe an incident. But he repeats one detail with enough consistency that it becomes the axis the entire conversation rotates around. He didn't go upstairs. Mendeecees and his friend did. That's it. And yet, online, it lands like a match near spilled gasoline. Not because it proves anything, but because it narrows uncertainty into a smaller space. The internet doesn't handle unknown well. It immediately begins trying to convert unknown into narrative. At first, it's subtle. People rewatch the clip. They start asking questions instead of making declarations. Wait, so who was actually there? Why is nobody responding? If this was so serious, why did it hit social media first? Then the questions start mutating into statements, not always overt, but implied. And that's where the danger spikes. Because once the crowd believes a story has a main character, everything becomes evidence, even silence. Especially silence. And Mendy stays quiet. No statement. No correction. No pushback. Again, silence doesn't prove anything. But it does something else. Something the internet understands better than law enforcement ever could. Silence creates a vacuum. And vacuums get filled. Fans begin doing what they always do when official narratives don't arrive. They start building unofficial ones. Some people claim they're connecting dots. Others call it reading between the lines. Some say they're just asking questions. But regardless of the framing, the momentum becomes unstoppable. Not because anyone has confirmed anything, but because the story now feels like it has structure. And once a story has structure, people start treating it like it's real, whether it's real or not. That's how reputations get dented without a single proven fact ever being introduced. Then comes the second shift, the industry shift. Because viewers don't just watch the drama, they watch the aftermath. They look for patterns. Who disappears, who stops posting, who shows up less, who becomes oddly careful. And suddenly, some fans begin noticing what they interpret as distance. Less visibility, less connection to familiar spaces, fewer public interactions. To be clear, that kind of observation can be meaningless. People step back for 1,000 reasons: work, family, contracts, strategy, health, life. But in the middle of a heated narrative, even normal absence gets interpreted as consequence. The conversation starts moving from what happened to what's happening now. And this is the stage where celebrity controversies stop being messy and start becoming strategic. Because every person involved is now choosing between two risky options: speak and risk making it worse, or stay silent and let the internet write the script. Funky seems aware of this trap. He doesn't demand that Mendeecees speak. He doesn't even directly call him out beyond what he says happened that night. But he does describe something that quietly shapes the audience's perception. The dynamic between Tamar and Mendeecees wasn't hidden. It was public. Restaurants, cars, group settings. In Funky's telling, it wasn't a secret that there was proximity, that there was physical closeness, that it was visible enough to make him uncomfortable. That detail matters because it reframes the night in a way audiences understand instinctively. If intimacy was already on display earlier, then the upstairs moment becomes a question mark people feel entitled to interrogate. Not because they should, because humans chase unfinished stories. And this one now feels unfinished. Then the internet does what it always does when a story feels unfinished. It starts hunting for receipts. Not real receipts, necessarily. Sometimes the receipts are just old interviews and clips stitched together with ominous music and captions like, "This aged bad. Pay attention." The signs were always there. And once those edits go viral, the conversation becomes less about what actually happened and more about what feels plausible. This is where everything starts turning into a perception war. One side argues Funky is doing damage control for himself, trying to make sure he isn't dragged into something that doesn't belong to him. The other side argues Funky is exposing something he thinks was deliberately framed in a misleading way. But regardless of which side people believe, almost everyone starts circling the same point. Why hasn't Tamar responded? Because Tamar's silence now becomes its own headline. And Tamar's silence becomes even louder because Funky's tone doesn't sound like someone fishing for attention. He sounds like someone who's fed up with being a character in somebody else's story. So the internet begins applying pressure. Not legally, socially. Pressure through comments. Pressure through reaction videos. Pressure through explain yourself discourse. And as that pressure builds, the focus shifts from the original night to something more personal. Control. Who controlled the narrative? Who benefited from the ambiguity? Who absorbed the backlash? Funky keeps circling back to the same theme: consent. He argues he never consented to being included in a public story that invites speculation about harm. He claims his name became attached to a narrative that made him look suspicious simply because he was nearby earlier. And then he drops a concept that makes the audience freeze because it's so recognizably modern. He implies that Tamar knows how to weaponize vagueness, not in a conspiracy mastermind way, in a media way, in a I know how the internet works way. That suggestion creates a split in the audience that becomes impossible to repair. Because if people believe Tamar's ambiguity was trauma-driven, then Funky looks cruel for calling her a liar. But if people believe the ambiguity was strategic, then Funky looks like the only person willing to stop playing along. And now the narrative becomes less about what happened and more about character. Is Funky a boundary setter or a betrayal artist? Is Tamar a victim of chaos or a curator of chaos? Is Mendeecees simply staying silent, or is silence doing reputational damage? And then a fourth figure starts appearing in the conversation more clearly. The network, the franchise, the machine. Because love and hip-hop isn't just a show. It's an ecosystem, and ecosystems respond to instability. Fans begin asking a different set of questions. If this story keeps trending, will the franchise distance itself? Will contracts shift? Will production avoid the heat? Will cast dynamics quietly change? Again, nothing official is required for these questions to reshape perception. Entertainment doesn't always punish based on proof. Sometimes it punishes based on risk. And risk is exactly what this story becomes once it's tied to serious insinuations. Blood, harm, near death, emergency-level language. This is where the internet's obsession turns into professional pressure. Because sponsors, platforms, networks, none of them want ambiguity when that ambiguity sounds dangerous. So now, even without confirmations, the idea of consequences behind the scenes starts feeling real to viewers, not because they can prove it, but because it fits how the industry operates. And that's where silence becomes even more suspicious, not morally, but strategically. Because if people were confident there was nothing to clarify, why not clarify? But then again, if people speak, they risk validating the controversy by acknowledging it. That's the paradox. And the paradox becomes the story. Funky's restraint becomes a weapon without him intending it to be. Because each time he repeats, "I don't know what happened upstairs," he simultaneously refuses to accuse and refuses to clear the air. He draws a boundary around his knowledge. But the boundary itself directs suspicion elsewhere. That's why this story is so corrosive. It doesn't require lies. It doesn't require facts. It requires implication, attention, and silence. And at this point, all three are already locked in motion. As this section deepens, a new emotional tone starts showing up in the audience reaction. Not shock, not excitement, unease. Because viewers start realizing something they don't want to admit out loud. Even if the truth never becomes public, the reputational damage can still be permanent. Because the public doesn't remember what was proven. It remembers what was repeated. And by now, the repeated things are: Funky called Tamar a liar. Funky said he wasn't upstairs. Funky said Mendeecees and his friend were upstairs. Tamar hasn't responded. Mendeecees hasn't responded. That becomes the entire framework of the controversy. And frameworks are powerful. They don't need details to be believed. They just need to be simple enough to spread. Then comes the final beat of part 3. The beat that shifts the story from celebrity drama to reputation trap. People begin asking, if Tamar speaks now, will it help or make it worse? If Mendeecees speaks now, will it clear his name or open new scrutiny? If Funky keeps talking, does he look truthful or petty? And underneath all of it sits the most unsettling question. What if nobody speaks again? Because if nobody speaks again, the internet won't stop. It will simply decide. And once the internet decides, revering perception becomes nearly impossible. That's how silence turns into outcome. Not because silence is guilt. Because silence is space. And space gets filled. By this point, the story has stopped behaving like gossip. It's behaving like fallout. The kind that doesn't explode all at once, but quietly rearranges relationships, reputations, and power, while everyone involved pretends nothing has changed. This is where Funky's argument sharpens into something more philosophical than personal. He stops talking about the night. He starts talking about permission. Or more precisely, the lack of it. Funky says something that cuts deeper than any accusation he's made so far. No one has the right to create a public storm that pulls other people into chaos without their consent. Not bloggers. Not fans. Not even friends. And that idea lands because it reframes everything retroactively. This wasn't just about what happened or didn't happen upstairs. It was about who got dragged into a narrative they never agreed to participate in. Funky explains that when Tamar went public and used language like, "I almost died," And I woke up in blood. The internet didn't just react emotionally, it went hunting. And when the internet hunts, it doesn't hunt carefully. It hunts broadly. Everyone who had been near Tamar that night became a potential suspect in the public imagination. Not officially, not legally, but socially. And Funky says that's where the real violation occurred. Not embarrassment. Not gossip. Exposure without agreement. He describes watching his name get folded into conspiracies he didn't create. Seeing his silence interpreted as guilt. Seeing his absence from that upstairs moment reframed as abandonment instead of intention. And he insists, over and over, that this didn't have to happen. One sentence could have stopped it. Leave Funky out of it. But that sentence never came. Instead, ambiguity did the work. The internet filled in blanks that never should have existed. And once those blanks were filled, Funky became collateral. This is the moment where the audience begins reassessing everything they thought this story was about. Because now it isn't just Tamar versus Funky. It's about how narratives move faster than consent. Funky admits something that surprises people. He expected backlash for speaking. He expected to be labeled messy, dramatic, bitter. And he accepts it. He says he'll wear the label. That admission does something subtle but powerful. It removes the leverage critics normally have. Once someone accepts the worst interpretation of themselves, the insults lose their bite. Funky reframes his decision to speak not as an attempt to win sympathy, but as choosing damage over erasure. He's not trying to be liked. He's trying not to be rewritten. And that distinction resonates deeply with a segment of the audience, especially people who understand how internet narratives flatten complexity. But it also raises a harder question. If speaking causes harm, and silence causes speculation, is there any safe option left? That question hangs over the entire controversy like a shadow. Because no matter what anyone does next, the damage has already been done. As Funky continues, his tone shifts again, not angrier but heavier. He starts talking about discomfort rather than accusation. He describes moments earlier in the night when Tamar and Mendy's behavior made him uneasy, not jealous, not judgmental, uncomfortable. Public settings, restaurants, cars. Moments where proximity crossed into something noticeable, where intimacy felt normalized in spaces where other people were present. He says he felt increasingly out of place. And that detail changes the way people process the entire timeline. Because if discomfort existed before anyone went upstairs, then the night didn't suddenly turn chaotic behind closed doors. The dynamic was already forming in public. That realization reframes everything. Suddenly the question isn't, what happened upstairs? It's, why were boundaries already blurred in plain sight? And that question is far more unsettling because it doesn't depend on secrecy. It depends on normalization. Funky revisits the decision that keeps haunting the story, why he left. He explains it again, carefully, knowing how controversial it sounds. He didn't go upstairs because he believed Tamar and Mendeecees wanted privacy. Not because he didn't care. Not because he abandoned her. But because he respected what he thought was their dynamic. Supporters see this as boundary setting. Critics see it as a failure of friendship. But both sides now understand something crucial. This argument only exists because of how the story was later framed. Without the narrative of confusion and near death, Funky's absence might never have been questioned at all. It only becomes controversial once ambiguity turns it into evidence. That's the danger of framing. It retroactively assigns meaning to neutral decisions. And Funky feels that weight deeply. He talks about being attacked online for things he didn't say, didn't do, and didn't witness. About how his refusal to speculate was treated as evasiveness instead of restraint. This is where empathy for him grows, not because people know he's right, but because they recognize the position he's in. In an internet-driven narrative, neutrality is rarely allowed. You're either defending yourself aggressively, or you're assumed to be hiding something. And Funky refuses both. He keeps repeating the same fact, not expanding it, not dramatizing it. Who went upstairs? Mendeecees and his friend. That repetition becomes his anchor. Not because it adds new information, but because it resists distortion. Funky refuses to let the story grow beyond what he personally knows. But in doing so, he unintentionally narrows the lens on others. And the audience responds by extrapolating. Speculation about legal pressure resurfaces. Talk of professional distancing grows louder. Questions about why no one else is speaking intensify. Again, none of this is confirmed. But perception doesn't need confirmation. Perception feeds on silence. Funky acknowledges that silence explicitly now. He describes how no one stepped in to correct the narrative. No one clarified roles. No one interrupted the momentum. And momentum, once it starts, is ruthless. It doesn't require truth. It requires continuation. As days pass, the conversation evolves again. Viewers stop waiting for answers and start bracing for consequences. Not legal ones, but reputational ones. The kind that don't come with announcements. The kind that quietly alter opportunities. This is where love and hip-hop re-enters the conversation more forcefully. Fans begin noticing patterns, absences, subtle shifts. Again, these could mean nothing. But in entertainment, uncertainty alone can be destabilizing. The story no longer belongs to any one person. It belongs to the internet. It's shaped by repetition, silence, and emotional inference, not facts. Funky seems to understand this better than anyone involved. He doesn't demand belief. He doesn't demand sympathy. He demands one thing only, that his role not be rewritten without his consent. That insistence, quiet, repetitive, restrained, becomes the backbone of how viewers interpret everything he said. And then comes the moment that reframes the entire controversy once more. Funky names who he believes was actually wronged the most. Not himself. Not Tamar. Yandy. That name lands softly, but decisively. It snaps the audience out of speculation and reminds them there are real people attached to these narratives who never asked to be involved either. This isn't just about mess. It's about collateral damage. And with that, Funky begins closing the door. He says he's done. He says he's moving on. He says he accepts whatever label people want to give him. Messy. Loud. Dramatic. He'll wear it. In doing so, he removes himself, at least verbally, from the cycle. But the story doesn't stop. Because by now, the audience understands something critical. This controversy was never sustained by facts. It was sustained by silence. And silence hasn't broken. By now, the outrage has cooled, but the tension hasn't. It's transformed. The loud arguments give way to something quieter and more dangerous: interpretation. People stop reacting emotionally and start deciding what they believe, not based on proof, but on pattern, tone, and absence. This is the phase where stories don't explode. They solidify. And once a narrative solidifies, it becomes incredibly hard to undo, even if new information arrives later. At this stage, Funky's anger fades into something else entirely. Exhaustion. He's no longer trying to convince anyone of anything. He's trying to explain why the silence that followed Tamar's public framing felt heavier than the accusations themselves. Because silence, in modern celebrity culture, is not neutral. It's interpretive. Funky explains that once Tamar went public and described near-death language, blood, danger, disorientation, the internet immediately shifted into blame mode. People weren't just asking what happened. They were asking who did it. And once that question exists, everyone connected becomes vulnerable. He says something that lands uncomfortably true for a lot of viewers. When people hear words like almost died, they don't wait for clarity. They assign guilt instinctively. They demand villains. And when no villain is named directly, the internet creates one. Or several. That's why Funky says silence stopped being an option for him. Not because he wanted attention, but because silence was already being interpreted as complicity. He describes watching theories spread that had nothing to do with anything he knew. Watching strangers stitch together assumptions and present them as certainty. Watching his name trend alongside implications he never agreed to carry. This is where the audience starts to see the emotional cost more clearly. Not the cost of being criticized, but the cost of being misread. Funky says the hardest part wasn't being attacked. It was realizing that no matter what he did, someone would be hurt, and he had already been positioned as expendable. That's when the conversation turns to survival. Because in public controversies, survival doesn't mean winning. It means minimizing damage. Funky admits that he understands why people choose silence. He understands why Tamar hasn't responded. He understands why Mendeecees hasn't spoken. Speaking invites scrutiny. Silence invites speculation. There is no safe lane. But Funky makes it clear that in his case, silence was killing him slowly. He says he watched his name become shorthand for suspicion, not because of evidence, but because of association. And once your name becomes shorthand, you stop being a person. You become a symbol. He refuses to accept that role. That's why his tone throughout the interview isn't triumphant. It's resigned. He knows speaking won't fix everything. He knows it might make some people hate him more. But at least, his silence won't be mistaken for consent. This is where the audience reaction fractures again, this time less aggressively, more philosophically. Some viewers argue that Tamar's silence is understandable. That trauma doesn't owe the public clarity. That not every experience needs to be explained neatly for consumption. Others argue that once a story is taken public, especially one that implies harm, clarity becomes a responsibility, not an option. And that debate is why this story feels heavier than typical celebrity drama. Because it's not just about gossip. It's about power. Who gets to frame pain? Who absorbs the consequences of that framing? Who gets believed and who gets questioned? Funky suggests something quietly radical, that public trauma narratives can unintentionally harm people who weren't the source of the trauma at all. He isn't saying Tamar lied about feeling hurt. He's saying the way pain was communicated mattered. Because ambiguity doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lands on real people. And in this case, it landed on him. The audience begins noticing that Funky never actually centers himself as the victim of the night. He centers himself as the victim of the aftermath. That distinction matters. He never claims harm happened upstairs. He never claims wrongdoing occurred. He claims narrative harm. And that's a kind of harm that doesn't show up in reports, but it shows up in reputations, relationships, and opportunities. This is where the discussion turns inward. Viewers start asking themselves uncomfortable questions. How often do we demand clarity from silence without realizing we're pressuring people into speaking before they're ready? But also, how often do we excuse ambiguity even when it implicates others? The story forces the audience to confront both sides at once. That's why it doesn't resolve cleanly. As this phase deepens, Funky becomes less reactive and more reflective. He talks about watching the internet debate his character instead of his actions, how people judged him based on tone rather than facts. He says something telling. The internet didn't want truth, it wanted coherence. And coherence is easier to achieve through assumption than evidence. That's why silence feels so loud. Silence lets the audience finish the story themselves. Funky also addresses something many people are thinking but few say out loud: timing. He admits people think he waited too long to speak. And he doesn't disagree. But he explains why he hesitated. He hoped the situation would deflate on its own. He hoped clarity would arrive organically. He hoped Tamar would clarify things in a way that removed him from the narrative. None of that happened. Instead, the story calcified. By the time he spoke, he wasn't entering a conversation. He was interrupting a verdict. That realization is what gives his words their weight. He wasn't trying to start something. He was trying to survive something already started. And that's where empathy for him grows, not because people know he's right, but because they recognize the trap. Once a narrative attaches itself to your name, there's no neutral response. Every choice becomes wrong in someone's eyes. Speak too much, you're messy. Speak too little, you're hiding. Speak late, you're opportunistic. Speak early, you're insensitive. The internet doesn't reward nuance. It punishes it. That's why Funky's restraint reads differently now. It's not calculated, it's defensive. And the audience begins to realize something else that's unsettling. This story doesn't actually need Tamar or Mendeecees to speak again to keep going. It's self-sustaining. It feeds on reactions to reactions. And that's when the weight of inevitability sets in. Even if the truth never becomes public, consequences already exist. Not legal ones, social ones, professional ones, reputational ones. And those consequences don't wait for facts. They wait for attention. As this section closes, the tone becomes quieter, not calmer. Heavier, because viewers realize this isn't about justice or resolution anymore. It's about impact. And impact doesn't require certainty. It only requires belief. By the time the conversation reaches its final phase, something irreversible has already happened. The story no longer belongs to the people who lived it. It belongs to the audience. That's the point Funky seems to understand most clearly, and it's why his final statements land with such a heavy sense of inevitability. He no longer sounds like someone fighting back. He sounds like someone accepting that once perception sets in, control is gone. This is where Funky stops circling the issue and says the quiet part out loud. He talks about order. Not emotional order, but logical order. He says if something truly catastrophic had happened, the response would have been immediate. Medical professionals, authorities, investigation, documentation. Not months of ambiguity. Not internet storytelling. Not silence punctuated by implication. That doesn't mean nothing happened. It means the way it unfolded doesn't align with how real emergencies unfold. That distinction is critical, and it's where Funky finally stops hedging. He says plainly that deep down, he believed nothing happened to Tamar in the way the internet was led to imagine. Not because he witnessed what happened upstairs, but because what happened afterward didn't reflect crisis behavior. He knows how that sounds. He knows people will recoil. And he says it anyway. That's the moment viewers realize Funky has crossed his own point of no return. He's no longer trying to protect feelings. He's choosing clarity over comfort, even if it costs him public goodwill. That choice reframes everything that came before it. This isn't someone half-speaking. This is someone done calculating. He then makes one of his most emotionally revealing admissions. He wasn't hurt by bloggers, trolls, or strangers. He was hurt by betrayal. He says Tamar was someone he considered a real friend, someone he supported without needing anything in return, someone he didn't expect to weaponize ambiguity in a way that left him exposed. And that hurt doesn't sound angry. It sounds tired. He explains that while Tamar benefited from attention, sympathy, and narrative control, he became collateral damage, someone the internet was comfortable suspecting, because his silence made him convenient. This isn't framed as jealousy. It's framed as imbalance. He insists again that he never wanted this public, that he asked to be left alone, that a single clarifying sentence could have prevented the entire spiral. But it never came. Instead, the story kept growing. He describes how ambiguity hardened into assumption, How fragments turned into headlines, how strangers assigned motives, how silence was treated as evidence. And by the time he spoke, the damage was already embedded. This is where Funky Names, who he believes was actually wronged the most in the entire situation. Not himself. Not Tamar. Yandy. That name lands like a reset button. Because it reminds everyone watching that beyond speculation and perception, there are people whose lives were impacted without consent. People who didn't speak, didn't frame anything, didn't invite attention. This single statement reframes the controversy from a personal feud into something broader. Collateral damage doesn't always belong to the loudest voice. Sometimes it belongs to the quietest one. After that, Funky shuts the door deliberately. He says he's done talking. He says he's moving on. He says people can label him however they want. Messy, loud, dramatic. He'll wear it. By accepting every label, he removes the incentive for others to keep assigning them. But the story doesn't end there. Because even when the speaker leaves the room, the narrative keeps moving. Tamar never directly responds to Funky's version. Mendeecees remains silent. And that silence becomes the final shape of the story. Not resolution. Stability. The controversy doesn't explode anymore, it settles. It becomes background noise, a reference point, a cloud that never quite disappears. Fans continue debating what silence means. Is it protection? Is it strategy? Is it legal advice? Is it fear? Is it exhaustion? No one knows. And that not knowing becomes the point. Because this story was never powered by answers. It was powered by absence. Absence of clarity. Absence of response. Absence of consent. Careers don't collapse loudly anymore. They erode quietly. Perception shifts subtly. Opportunities pause. Relationships cool. And no announcement ever explains why. That's why this situation feels heavier than a typical celebrity controversy. It doesn't have a climax. It doesn't have a verdict. It has inertia. Before the conversation fades completely, Funky leaves the audience with an unspoken challenge, one that lingers longer than any accusation. Who handled this the worst? The person who spoke too much? Or the people who didn't speak at all? Did Funky cross a line by finally telling his side? Or was he reacting to pressure that had already spiraled out of control? Did Tamar's silence protect her? Or did it leave too much room for interpretation to grow? And when it comes to Mendeecees, does staying quiet actually help in moments like this, or does it quietly make things worse? There are no clean answers. And maybe that's the point. In today's media landscape, silence doesn't stop stories. It reshapes them. Once perception sets in, revering it is harder than starting it. And long after the clips stop circulating and the comment sections slow down, the impact remains, embedded not in facts, but in memory. This story didn't end. It stabilized. And if anyone involved decides to speak again, everything could shift in an instant. Until then, what remains isn't truth or resolution. It's weight. And weight has a way of changing things, even when no one says another word.